welcome back to my channel. I am a storyteller, a seeker and recorder of the echoes of the past, the stories that people whisper in the dark. I live in Norfolk, Virginia, a land rich in American history, where every inch of land seems to have a secret to tell. And tonight, I am going to tell you a story that has haunted me for years. A story without monsters bearing their fangs, without cheap scares. It is a story about sadness, about forgetting, and about a presence that never truly leaves. Our story takes place in what seems like an ordinary place, a high school. Let's call it Hickory Grove High School. That's not its real name because I have to respect the privacy of those involved. But trust me, this school is real, and what happened inside its walls is also completely real. It all started on a chilly October evening in 2018. I received an email from a man named Arthur Henderson. Arthur was the head janitor at Hickory Grove, a man in his 60s with white hair and hands calloused from decades of hard work. He had worked at the school since it was under construction, more than 30 years ago. He knew every crack in the wall, every creak in the floor, every secret nook and cranny where students skipped class. Arthur loved the school like it was his own home, and that was why he had reached out to me. In the email, he hesitated, as if embarrassed to admit what he was about to say. "Sir," he wrote, "I know this sounds crazy, and you may think I'm a dork, but there's something wrong at Hickory Grove. Not a leaky pipe or a burned-out light bulb, but a different kind of wrong. A wrong that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you're alone at school at night. I've received hundreds of emails like this in my career. Most of them are the product of imagination, of old houses making strange noises, or of overly sensitive minds. But there was something about Arthur's writing that caught my attention. There was an honesty, an unvarnished fear, and a helplessness that oozed from each word. I decided to call him. Arthur's voice was shaky but determined over the phone. "I've worked here for 32 years, he said. "I've heard all sorts of noises in this building. The wind whistling through the windows, the heater starting up, mice running across the ceiling. I can tell them apart. But the things I've heard lately, they're different." It had all started about 6 months earlier, he said. At first it was just small things. Locker doors that had been locked would open. Stacks of books in the library would shift when no one was there. Light footsteps would run down the 9th floor hallway at 2 in the morning. Arthur initially assumed it was a change in air pressure, or the building was aging. He reassured himself with logical explanations. But then the phenomena became more and more clear and frightening. "One time," Arthur said, his voice dropping, "I was mopping the floor in the dining room. It was about midnight. It was completely quiet. Suddenly I heard laughter, a giggle very clear like a child's. It came from the stage in the auditorium right next to the dining room. I ran out there and turned on all the lights. There was no one there. But the feeling that someone had just been there, watching me from the darkness, it sent a chill down my spine." Arthur wasn't alone. Several teachers who stayed late to grade papers also experienced strange things. Miss Davidson, the music teacher, swore she heard a single piano key ringing in the locked music room. Mr. Miller, the history teacher, was planning a lesson in his classroom one evening when he saw a small dark figure gliding through the glass window in the hallway. When he opened the door to look, the hallway was empty and eerily silent. But the final straw, the one that prompted Arthur to contact me, involved modern technology. Hickory Grove High School had recently installed a new security camera system. The cameras were motion detecting. One Tuesday morning, Arthur went to the principal's office to get his keys, as usual. He found the principal, Mr. Peterson, sitting in front of the security monitor with a frown on his face. "Arthur, come here and look at this," Mr. Peterson said. He rewound a video recorded at 3:14 a.m. in the auditorium. The auditorium was dark, lit only by the dim light from the emergency exit signs. Suddenly, one of the camera's motion-detecting spheres flickered. On the screen, something blurry. A small shadow moved slowly across the front row of seats toward the stage. It had no clear shape, just a space darker than the surrounding darkness, a distortion of air. It glided unnaturally, making no sound before disappearing into the darkness at the foot of the stage. Mr. Peterson assumed it was a camera glitch, an insect flying across the lens, or a strange reflection of light. But Arthur knew better. He had felt it. That dark figure was the source of the giggling he had heard. After hearing Arthur's whole story, I knew I had to go there. Hickory Grove was more than just an old building. It had a story to tell. Before I hung up, I asked Arthur one last question. "Mr. Arthur, do you know anything about the history of the land on which the school is built?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Arthur sighed. "People don't like to talk about it, sir. But the old folks in the area like me know. Before this school, this was part of the colonial Fairweather plantation. And on the west corner of this land, where the football field and the parking lot are now, there used to be a small cemetery, a long-forgotten family cemetery. The cold was no longer just in Norfolk. It was creeping up my spine. A new school built on the site of an old cemetery. It was a classic recipe for unresolved tragedy. I told Arthur I was going to Hickory Grove that Friday night. I wanted to experience the whispers in the empty hallways for myself. Little did I know, I was about to enter a story far sadder and more terrifying than I could have imagined. The darkness in Hickory Grove was more than an absence of light. It was a reality, a memory, and it waited.
In preparation for my visit, I spent a few days doing some preliminary research. Hickory Grove, as Arthur had said, was built in the late 1980s. It was a fairly typical building of the period. Long corridors of beige tiles, rows of blue and grey metal lockers, and large windows overlooking the vast sports fields. The building had 2 main floors and a basement, mostly used for storage and technical rooms. The auditorium and cafeteria were in a separate wing, connected to the main building by a glass corridor. On the outside, it was the epitome of normalcy, of vibrant college life. But it was the contrast between its daytime appearance and its nighttime stories that made it so hauntingly alluring. I searched for information on Fairweather Plantation and Fairweather Cemetery. Information is scarce. Records from the 18th and 19th centuries are fragmentary. I found only a few short articles in the local library archives. The plantation was owned by the Fairweather family, a well-to-do family in the 1700s. They disappeared from the historical records around the early 1800s, perhaps having moved elsewhere, or the family had died out. As for the cemetery, there is an old cadastral map from 1920 that marks a small area as Old Cemetery, located exactly where Arthur described it. By the 1950s, the land was purchased by the city, and the cemetery was no longer mentioned in later planning documents. It was bulldozed, forgotten, erased from the city's memory. But history has a strange habit. It never really goes away. It just sinks beneath the surface, like tombstones buried under the asphalt of a parking lot. And sometimes it manages to rise again. I drove to Hickory Grove on Friday night. The sky was overcast, grey clouds blocking out the moon. The school was dark, save for a few security lights that cast a weak, yellow glow. It looked completely different from the pictures I'd seen online. There was no laughter, no bells, just a heavy silence, a silence that seemed to listen. Arthur was waiting for me at the back door. He was wearing a dark blue janitor's uniform and was holding a large ring of keys. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low, as if afraid to disturb the silence of the school. "Everyone's gone. It's just us now." As the heavy metal door slammed shut behind me, a strange feeling washed over me. The air inside seemed thicker and colder than outside. The smell of the school at night was a peculiar mixture. Floor wax, chalk, old library books, and something else, a musty, ancient smell, like the smell of old, damp earth. "Where do we start, Mr. Arthur?" I asked. He looked around, his eyes filled with worry. "The strangest things happen in the second-floor hallways and in the auditorium. We can start on the second floor." We climbed the stairs. Our footsteps echoed in the silence. The second-floor hallway stretched out before us, dark and empty. The only light came from the windows overlooking the parking lot, casting dim shadows on the floor. On either side were rows of lockers, as silent as metal coffins. The feeling of being watched that Arthur had described began to creep into my mind. It felt like hundreds of invisible eyes were watching us from the shadows of empty classrooms. I pulled out my equipment, a high-sensitivity digital recorder, an EMF meter, and a thermal imaging camera. "I'm going to set the recorder up here, in the middle of the hallway," I told Arthur. "And we're going to walk down the hallway quietly. Let's see if we can pick up anything." We started walking slowly and carefully. The air was so cold I could see my breath. The EMF meter in my hand remained silent in the background. We walked down the hall to the end of the aisle, where there was a large window overlooking the football field. "Right here," Arthur whispered, pointing out the window. "The old cemetery is out there somewhere, under the grass and tar." We stood there in silence, looking out into the dark space outside. Suddenly, the EMF meter in my hand started beeping. The needle jumped from 0.5 milligauss to 5, then 10. It blinked wildly. "It's here," I said softly. "There's an unusual source of electromagnetic energy right here." At the same time, we both heard it. An extremely small sound, but unmistakable. Click. It came from behind us, in the middle of the hallway. It sounded like the latch of a locker door being turned. We whirled around. The hallway was as dark and empty as before. But there was one thing that was different. One of the locker doors in the middle of the row, number 237, was now ajar. A cold blast of air swept over me. Arthur took a step back, his face pale. I slowly approached the open cupboard door. I used the flashlight on my phone to shine inside. It was empty. Just a few scraps of paper and a strange scent, like the faint scent of long-dried lavender. "No way," Arthur stammered. "I checked all the lockers before I left work. They were all locked." I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was a message, a greeting. Something in this school knew we were here, and it was starting its game. I turned back to the recorder, hoping it had caught something. Our nighttime stroll through Hickory Grove was just beginning, and I had a feeling that, before dawn, the whispers in the hallways would become screams.
I motioned for Arthur to stay put, while I slowly walked back to my recorder. I didn't want to disturb the scene, didn't want to add any of our sounds to that precious recording. Carefully picking up the recorder, I plugged in my headphones and started listening to the last few minutes of the recording. Arthur stood there holding his breath, his eyes fixed on me, searching my face for an answer. In my headphones, I heard our footsteps on the tile floor. Arthur's whispers as he pointed out the location of the old cemetery, the shrill beeping of the EMF meter. I filtered those sounds out of my head, and then right before the dry metallic click of the closet door, I heard it. A very small sound. It was not a word nor a voice. It was like a sigh, a soft breath that passed through the microphone. But it did not carry the warmth of life. It carried a deep sadness, a weariness that had lasted for centuries. It was the sound of resignation. I played it back 5, 6 times. There was no mistaking it. There was an unusual sound that had been recorded, a sound that did not belong to me or Arthur. I took off my headphones. "It recorded," I said, my voice low. Just before the door opened, there was a sigh. Arthur shivered, his arms wrapping around his shoulders as if to keep himself warm. "Oh, God, so I'm not crazy." "No, Mr. Arthur," I replied. "You are not mad. There is something here with us, and it wants us to know it." I approached locker number 237 again. The scent of dried lavender seemed to have faded, but the feeling of it still lingered. I wondered, why this locker? Does the number 237 have any significance? Why the smell of lavender? These were pieces of a puzzle that I could not yet figure out. I wrote down all these details in my notebook. Every detail, no matter how small, could be a key. "Where should we go next?" Arthur asked, his voice less shaky now, replaced with a cautious curiosity. "The auditorium," I replied without hesitation. "Where you heard the laughter, where the security camera caught the shadow. If this hallway is a greeting, then the auditorium could be where the main story is taking place." We left the second-floor hallway. As we walked, I couldn't help but look back. The door of locker number 237 was still ajar in the darkness, like a mouth whispering a secret we couldn't hear. The path to the auditorium took us through a glass corridor that connected the 2 school buildings. Outside, it was pitch black. Inside, it was as if we were walking on a bridge suspended in midair. The light from the distant security lights cast eerie shadows of ourselves, elongated and distorted. Every step on the cold floor echoed ominously. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if someone were walking alongside us on the other side of the glass, in the darkness of the schoolyard. Finally, we reached the heavy oak double doors of the auditorium. Arthur inserted the key into the lock, the metal clicking dryly. The doors creaked open, revealing a deep, dark space within. The atmosphere in the auditorium was completely different from the rest of the school. It was heavy and overwhelmingly quiet. The smell of dust, the old velvet of the stage curtains, and the smell of old wood mixed together, forming a scent of time. This auditorium had a capacity of about 800 people. Hundreds of empty chairs stretched out in the darkness, facing the vast stage. They were like an army of silent spectators, ghosts waiting for a play that would never begin. Only the dim blue light from the exit signs was the only source of light, not enough to dispel the darkness, but only making it more ghostly. "There it is," Arthur whispered. "The laughter I hear is coming from the stage." I turned on the thermal imaging camera. The screen showed a world of different colors, orange and yellow where there was warmth, blue and purple where there was cold. Most of the auditorium was a deep blue, the temperature dropping after a long day of being empty. "Okay, here's the plan," I said to Arthur. "We're going to go down and sit in the center row. I'm going to do an EVP, electronic voice phenomenon session. I'm going to ask questions, and we're going to be completely silent so the recorder can pick up any sounds in response. Whatever you hear or feel, don't react immediately. Just let it happen." Arthur nodded, fear and determination clear in his eyes. We walked slowly down the aisle. The silence here was unusual. It wasn't an empty silence, but a tense silence, as if the air was vibrating with an invisible energy. We sat down in the 10th row. I placed the recorder on the empty seat next to me, the EMF meter on my lap, and held the thermal camera in my hand. "I'll start," I said softly. I took a deep breath. "Is anyone here with us?" I asked into the void, my voice echoing strangely in the vast auditorium. "We come here out of respect. We just want to hear your story. Silent, The EMF meter remained silent. The thermal camera showed nothing unusual. I waited about a minute. My name is, and this is Mr. Arthur. He's the caretaker of this place. Do you know him? Still heavy silence. I began to feel a little disappointed. Maybe the phenomenon in the hallway was just a coincidence. Maybe we wouldn't find anything here. Arthur nudged me gently. He said nothing, just raised a finger and pointed toward the stage. And then I heard it. A very small, almost inaudible sound, a giggle. Hi, hi, hi. It was clear, melodious, but with a cold sadness. It did not come from any particular place on the stage, but seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the air and fading almost immediately. The hairs on my arms stood up. It was the sound Arthur had described. I quickly raised the thermal camera, panning the lens toward the stage. The screen was still a dark blue, but wait, there was something. In the center of the stage, where the space should have been completely empty, there was another color. A blue and purple color, significantly colder than its surroundings. It was indistinct in shape, but about the size of a 7 or 8-year-old child. It stood still, an icy hole in the ocean of room temperature. Arthur, I whispered, not taking my eyes off the screen. Can you see anything on the stage with your naked eyes? No, nothing, he stammered, his voice shaking. Just darkness. But it's there, I said. On the thermal imager, a cold spot, shaped like a child. The cold streak began to move. It didn't walk, it drifted, gliding across the stage toward the wings, just like the shadow in the security footage. My heart stopped. This was irrefutable evidence. We were seeing it now. At first, I thought it was just static noise. But when I amplified the sound and used noise filtering software, another sound emerged from the silence. A voice whispered, faint as a breeze. A child's voice. And it said two words in English, but carrying a sadness that transcends all languages. So cold. So cold. Arthur looked at me, seeing my horrified expression. What did you find? I took off my headphones, my hands shaking. I turned on the speaker and played him the denoised audio again. So cold. The child's voice echoed in the small room, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Arthur sat down heavily on the chair, his face pale. Now we had it. Not just a sight, a feeling. We had a voice, a cry from the other side. A young soul trapped in this school, in an endless cold. And I knew my investigation had only just begun. My mission now was not just to document the phenomenon. It was to discover the identity of this child, to discover why he was so cold, and most importantly, to discover the tragic story that had buried him beneath the foundations of Hickory Grove High School. The hunt in the historical archives was about to begin. My first and only destination was a city treasure, the Sargent Memorial Collection, housed within the Norfolk Public Library. This was the city's attic, a labyrinth of genealogical records, antique maps, property deeds, and long-dead newspapers. If an answer to the Fairweather mystery existed anywhere, it would be here. Stepping into the local history room, I was immediately enveloped by a sense of reverence. The air smelled of old paper and book-binding glue. All around me were towering shelves of leather-bound volumes and patrons hunched over massive documents with scholarly focus. The silence here was not the menacing silence of Hickory Grove. It was the silence of respect, of 1,000 stories waiting patiently to be heard. I approached the reference desk, where an older woman with tortoiseshell glasses and neatly pinned gray hair was working. A small plaque on her desk read, Mrs. Gable, Archivist. Good morning, she said, her voice soft but clear. How can I help you? Good morning, Mrs. Gable. I'm researching an old Norfolk family by the name of Fairweather. They owned a plantation in the 18th century on the land where Hickory Grove High School now stands. Mrs. Gable's eyes lit up with professional interest. Fairweather, she repeated, tapping her fingers on the desk. A very old name. Yes, let me see what we have. She led me to a research computer and began typing with practiced efficiency. A few moments later, a list of documents appeared. Just as I thought, she said. We have land deeds confirming their ownership of that tract from 1740 until about 1810. We also have them in the genealogical records, Richard and Eleanor Fairweather. They had 2 children, a daughter and a son. My heart beat a little faster. Do you have the children's names? She squinted at the screen. The daughter was Prudence, born 1775. The son, here we are, Thomas, born 1780. Thomas, a boy, born in 1780. If his story ended sometime in the late 18th century, he would have been only 7, 8, or 9 years old. A perfect match for the size of the cold spot I saw on the thermal camera. Are there any records of what happened to them? I asked. The records seemed to stop after 1810. That's the difficult part with records from that era, Mrs. Gable admitted. They can be incomplete. They could have moved away. The line could have simply died out. There are no wills filed in Norfolk after Richard's time. However, she paused, tapping her chin in thought. If there was a tragedy, it might not be in the official documents. Sometimes the real stories are in the old newspapers, or even personal diaries. She pointed me to a corner of the room dominated by large beige machines that looked like bizarre time travel devices, microfilm readers. This is our archive of the Norfolk Gazette and Public Ledger, she explained. If something noteworthy happened, it might be in there. It will take time, but if you're patient, you might find something. I thanked her and set to work. Spending hours in front of a microfilm reader is an exercise in patience. The sickening green glow, the monotonous hum of the motor, the careful work of scrolling through the film, page after blurry page flashing across the screen. I started with the year 1785 and began moving forward, scanning news of arriving ships, tobacco prices, political debates, and advertisements for runaway slaves. The life of the 18th century unfolded before me, both vibrant and alien. My first and only destination was a city treasure, the Sargent Memorial Collection, housed within the Norfolk Public Library. This was the city's attic, a labyrinth of genealogical records, antique maps, property deeds, and long-dead newspapers. If an answer to the Fairweather mystery existed anywhere, it would be here. Stepping into the local history room, I was immediately enveloped by a sense of reverence. The air smelled of old paper and book-binding glue. All around me were towering shelves of leather-bound volumes and patrons hunched over massive documents with scholarly focus. The silence here was not the menacing silence of Hickory Grove. It was the silence of respect, of 1,000 stories waiting patiently to be heard. I approached the reference desk, where an older woman with tortoiseshell glasses and neatly pinned gray hair was working. A small plaque on her desk read, Mrs. Gable, Archivist. Good morning, she said, her voice soft but clear. How can I help you? Good morning, Mrs. Gable. I'm researching an old Norfolk family by the name of Fairweather. They owned a plantation in the 18th century on the land where Hickory Grove High School now stands. Mrs. Gable's eyes lit up with professional interest. Fairweather, she repeated, tapping her fingers on the desk. A very old name. Yes, let me see what we have. She led me to a research computer and began typing with practiced efficiency. A few moments later, a list of documents appeared. Just as I thought, she said. We have land deeds confirming their ownership of that tract from 1740 until about 1810. We also have them in the genealogical records, Richard and Eleanor Fairweather. They had 2 children, a daughter and a son. My heart beat a little faster. Do you have the children's names? She squinted at the screen. The daughter was Prudence, born 1775. The son, here we are, Thomas, born 1780. Thomas, a boy, born in 1780. If his story ended sometime in the late 18th century, He would have been only 7, 8, or 9 years old, a perfect match for the size of the cold spot I saw on the thermal camera. "Are there any records of what happened to them?" I asked. "The records seemed to stop after 1810. "That's the difficult part with records from that era," Mrs. Gable admitted. "They can be incomplete. They could have moved away. The line could have simply died out. There are no wills filed in Norfolk after Richard's time. However," she paused, tapping her chin in thought, "if there was a tragedy, it might not be in the official documents. Sometimes the real stories are in the old newspapers, or even personal diaries." She pointed me to a corner of the room dominated by large beige machines that looked like bizarre time travel devices, microfilm readers. "This is our archive of the Norfolk Gazette and Public Ledger," she explained. "If something noteworthy happened, it might be in there. It will take time, but if you're patient, you might find something." I thanked her and set to work. Spending hours in front of a microfilm reader is an exercise in patience. The sickening green glow, the monotonous hum of the motor, the careful work of scrolling through the film, page after blurry page flashing across the screen. I started with the year 1785 and began moving forward, scanning news of arriving ships, tobacco prices, political debates, and advertisements for runaway slaves. The life of the 18th century unfolded before me, both vibrant and alien. February 14th, 1788, I visited with Eleanor today. It breaks my heart to see her. She is wasted away, her eyes sunk deep with a grief for which there are no words. She took me to see little Thomas's grave beneath the old oak. Upon the small, simple stone, Eleanor had placed a little cloth pouch. She told me it was filled with dried lavender from her garden. It was Thomas's favorite scent, she said, and she wanted her son to be surrounded by it always, to warm him in the cold earth. She has made dozens of these sachets, placing them in his room under his pillow, and brings a new one to his grave each day. I fear this grief will be the ruin of her. I closed the journal. The air was trapped in my throat. The lavender was not a random detail. It was a symbol of a mother's love, a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to bring warmth and comfort to her lost child. I understood now. Thomas wasn't just trapped by his tragic death. He might also be searching for that comfort. Perhaps in some way, he associated that scent with safety, with his mother's love. And the opening of locker number 237 wasn't an act of aggression. Perhaps inside that locker, some student had left a sachet of lavender, and the spirit of Thomas, in his endless loneliness, was simply drawn to it. It was an act of searching. I packed up my things, my mind reeling. The story had changed completely. This was no longer a ghost story about a haunted school. It was the tragedy of Thomas Fairweather, a boy frozen in time, forever seeking warmth and the familiar scent of his mother's love. I left the library as the sun began to set, painting the Norfolk sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. I pulled out my phone and dialed Arthur Henderson's number. He answered on the first ring. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice low and serious, "I know who's in your school." There was silence on the other end of the line. "His name is Thomas." I knew our investigation was about to enter a new phase. The next stage wasn't about collecting evidence anymore. It was about attempting to communicate, to understand, and maybe, just maybe, to finally bring peace to a soul who had been so cold for so long. I spent the next 20 minutes on the phone, telling Arthur every detail I had discovered. I told him about the terrible blizzard of 1788, about the 8-year-old boy lost in the cold winter night, about his lonely departure on the deserted field. I told him about the grieving mother, Eleanor, and her desperate attempt to warm her dead child with the scent of lavender. As I spoke, I heard Arthur's breathing become heavier. He didn't interrupt me. He just listened. When I finished, there was another silence, but this time it was not one of shock, but of understanding and deep sadness. "Good God," Arthur finally whispered. Poor boy, poor boy. All these years he was alone there, in the cold, and we were afraid of him. His voice broke on the last words. His fear had vanished, replaced by a vast compassion and almost grandfatherly affection for his unfortunate grandchild. That's why it was most active in the auditorium, I explained. That's where the boy fell, and that's why it was drawn to the scent of lavender. It wasn't a random phenomenon. It was the memory of his mother's love. "So what do we do now?" Arthur asked, his voice now filled with new determination. "We can't just leave the boy like this." He said we. In that moment, he went from being an informant to a companion. "I have an idea," I said, "but it might be too intense. We approached the boy as investigators. Now we need to approach him as friends. We won't come to record or measure anymore. We'll come to bring him what he's looking for." "You mean lavender?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "We'll go back there to the auditorium. We'll bring the lavender, and we won't ask the boy to talk. We'll talk to him. We'll let him know that we know his story, and we're sorry." Arthur didn't hesitate for a second. "Tonight. Come after everyone has gone home. I'll wait." That night, as I drove back to Hickory Grove, the atmosphere seemed to have changed. The school was still dark, but to me it no longer seemed scary. Instead, there was a sadness that pervaded. I no longer felt like I was entering a haunted place. I felt like I was visiting the grave of a forgotten child. In the passenger seat beside me were not EMF meters or thermal cameras. Instead, there was a small paper bag. Inside were 5 handmade muslin bags filled with the highest quality dried lavender I could find. The scent was rich, sweet, and peaceful, filling the car. I also carried a small electronic candle, a battery-powered one that flickered like a real flame, a symbol of warmth, safety, and no fire hazard. My tools tonight were not technological, but symbolic. Arthur waited for me at the back door as usual, but this time there was no fear in his expression. There was worry, but above all, determination. "I'm ready," he said simply. We stepped inside. The silence of the school remained the same, but our perception was different. Every creak no longer seemed like a threat, but like a sigh. Every dark hallway no longer seemed spooky, but like an endless sadness. We headed straight for the auditorium. The familiar path now took on new meaning. We didn't say a word. There was no need. We both knew the gravity of the task at hand. As Arthur opened the oak double doors, the familiar cold air rushed out to greet us, but this time, I didn't shiver with fear. I shivered with compassion. We walked straight down to the stage. It was the same big, dark, empty space. I felt Thomas's presence almost immediately. It wasn't a feeling of being watched, but of knowing. He knew we were back. We stood in the center of the stage where I had recorded the cold spot on the thermal camera. I slowly opened my paper bag. "Thomas," I began, my voice echoing softly in the silence. I didn't speak loudly, but rather as if I were talking to a frightened child in the corner. "We're here. We're back." I took out the electric candle and turned it on. A warm, gentle yellow light spread out, forming a small circle on the dark stage floor. "We know you're cold. We're sorry about that." Then I took out each bag of lavender one by one. As I took them out, the sweet, clean scent filled the air, overpowering the dusty, musty smell of the auditorium. "We know about your mother, Eleanor," I continued, my voice starting to crack. "We know how much she loved you, and we know she wanted to bring this scent to you." I gently placed 5 lavender bags in a circle around the electronic candle. For a moment, nothing happened. There was just silence, the smell of lavender, in the flickering candlelight. And then it began, not a giggle, not a whisper, but it was a cry, a child's sob, heartbroken and broken. It came from no particular direction, but seemed to emanate from the very air around us. The cry filled the auditorium, a sound of pain pent up for over 2 centuries, now released. The temperature dropped suddenly and violently. I could see my breath and Arthur's turn into thick white clouds. A thin layer of frost began to form on the edge of the stage, shimmering in the weak candlelight. The cold was more than a feeling this time. It was a physical presence, a chill that bit into the bone, carrying with it all the despair of a long-ago snowstorm. Boom! 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 The rows of seats in the auditorium began to shake violently. At first, just a few rows, then the entire auditorium. Hundreds of plastic chairs were violently bouncing up and down, creating a chaotic and terrifying sound, like a giant seizure. The two giant red velvet curtains on either side of the stage, which had been heavy and motionless, now began to flap as if a hurricane were sweeping through, even though the air in the auditorium was completely still. This wasn't an attack. I realized that. This was a rage of pain, the rage of an abandoned child finally heard. All the boy's fear, loneliness, coldness, and confusion pouring out at once. Arthur stood beside me, his face pale, but he did not back down. He stared at the space in front of him, where we had placed the lavender bags, and tears began to roll down his cheeks. In the midst of the chaos, Arthur did something I will never forget. He slowly held out a hand, palm up, a gesture of comfort and acceptance. "It's okay, son," he said, his voice shaking but full of affection. "It's okay, Thomas. I'm here. Everything will be okay." And at that moment, amid the clatter of chairs and the flutter of curtains, a miracle happened. Arthur let out a gasp. His eyes widened. He looked down at his outstretched hand. It touched me," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "I felt it, a small hand, cold as ice. An invisible cold hand touched his warm, calloused one for a brief moment before withdrawing. A connection, a contact between two worlds, fueled by compassion. Immediately after that moment, the chaos ended. As quickly as it began, it stopped. The thumping of chairs stopped. The velvet curtains fell back, motionless. The sobs faded into the air, leaving only a deep silence. The temperature slowly returned to normal. The frost melted away. We stood there on stage in silence. The scent of lavender hung in the air. The electric candles continued to flicker insistently. The pain seemed to have passed, leaving an empty but peaceful silence. We were silent for several minutes. There were no words to describe what had just happened. Finally, I decided it was time to go. We had done what we came to do. As we turned to leave the stage, I turned on my tape recorder out of habit, not really expecting anything. We left the lavender sachets and candles there. A gift, a memorial. As we were halfway toward the exit, one last sound, so faint it was almost inaudible, wafted through the air. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a whisper of, "It's cold." It was a single word, a child's whisper of hope and doubt. And my tape recorder, with its high sensitivity, caught it. "Mom." We left Hickory Grove, leaving Thomas with the scent of his mother and a new ray of hope. I knew the war wasn't over, but an important battle had been won. A connection had been made. He was no longer just reliving his pain. He was beginning to remember love, and that was the first step on the long road home. The days passed in an unusual silence. I called Arthur every day to check on him. His reports were consistent. The school had changed. "It's peaceful," he said on the phone, his voice laced with undisguised wonder. "All the weirdness has stopped. No more footsteps, no more locker doors opening by themselves. Teachers staying late no longer feel scared. But it's not empty, sir. It's different. Before, the silence at night had always felt tense, like someone was holding their breath. Now it's like a deep sleep, a peaceful sleep." "What about the auditorium?" I asked. "I still go there to clean every night," he replied. "The electric candle is dead, but I still leave it there. And the lavender smell, it still lingers. Very faint, but it's there, like a memory." Arthur's words confirmed what I had been feeling. Thomas's emotional outburst had released pent-up negative energy. He was no longer trapped in the cycle of his tragic death. The reminder of his mother's love had broken the cycle. But that also raises a new question. If Thomas is no longer suffering, then what is he doing? He is still there, suspended between two worlds. He is comforted, but he is not free. He is waiting, waiting for his mother. A waiting we can never fulfill. Leaving an 8-year-old alone in an empty auditorium, even a peaceful one, forever is not a solution. It is not kindness. It is a different kind of abandonment. Mr. Arthur, I said after a moment of thought, we need to do one last thing. One thing that will give Thomas some real closure. We can't bring his mother back, but we can do something else. We can give him his identity back forever. What do you mean? I want to talk to Principal Peterson, I explained. Both of us. We won't tell him a ghost story. We'll tell him a historical story. We'll show him the documents I found. We'll explain that the paranormal phenomena in the school are echoes of a forgotten tragedy, and we'll ask the school to do something very simple, but meaningful. We'll ask them to erect a small memorial. Arthur was silent in thought. A stele? That's right, not a ghostly plaque. A historical plaque. Something solemn and simple. It wouldn't talk about ghosts or hauntings. It would just tell the truth. Something like, in memory of Thomas Fairweather, 1780 to 1788, a boy who laid down his life on these grounds. May his story never be forgotten. That way, he wouldn't be an anonymous ghost. He would be Thomas Fairweather, a recognized part of the school's history. We would anchor him in memory, not tragedy. That's a good idea, Arthur said softly, his voice full of emotion. A very good idea. The boy deserves it. The meeting with Principal Peterson took place on a Thursday afternoon in his office. The room was neat and sunny, a stark contrast to the subject of our conversation. Mr. Peterson, a practical and somewhat skeptical man, listened politely but cautiously as I began my presentation. I didn't talk about EVP or cold spots. Instead, I spread out copies of old newspaper articles and diary pages on his desk. I told Thomas Fairweather's story like a historian, not a psychic investigator, but it was Arthur who convinced the principal. When I finished, Arthur began to speak. He didn't talk about the scary phenomena. He talked about the feeling of the school. He talked about the 32 years he had spent caring for every brick, every corridor. And then, his voice breaking, he talked about that night in the auditorium. He described it not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as an emotional experience. Headmaster, Arthur said, his eyes filling with tears. I felt that boy's hand. It wasn't imagination. I felt his loneliness and coldness. And now, that coldness is gone. The school is safe again. All the boy wanted was to be known, to be remembered. Mr. Peterson stared at the two of us, then looked down at the historical documents on his desk. He remembered the security footage of the shadowy figure that he had assumed was a technical error. He remembered the sporadic complaints from the teachers, and he knew that, after the night we described, the complaints had stopped. Finally, he sighed, a sigh of acceptance. All right, he said. I don't pretend to understand everything, but I trust you, Arthur, and I trust history. This boy is part of the school's history, whether we know it or not. We're going to make that plaque. The ceremony took place a week later. It was not a big event. There were just 3 of us, me, Arthur, and Principal Peterson. They had chosen a beautiful location, under a large oak tree on the lawn next to the auditorium, near where we believed the old field had been.